Please identify yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Yan Meishi. I'm a geopolitical analyst at Galco Dragonomics. So listening to the narrative and looking at the slide that spans decades, I was struck by two contrasts. One is that the Chinese people's fashion has changed over time, but the fashion of ordinary correspondents has not changed. The second contrast, which is the question, is it seems the paradox of when China was actually poorer, weaker, when it was just opening up to the world, Chinese leaders seem to be more confident. They had this long-form, freewheeling interviews. Deng Xiaoping had that with Michael Wallace, and Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji had this freewheeling.
Jiang Zemin had it with me.
Right, freewheeling press conferences. But when China became richer and more integrated with the world, the Chinese leaders clamped up. They closed themselves and never made themselves available to reporters. I could not recall anything that Wen Jiabao or Hu Jintao did.
Wen Jiabao did one thing with Christian Amanpour, but less. You're absolutely right. Less and less and less.
Right. So why is that the case?
Ask them. I don't know. I don't know, but there, whether it's partly we're more successful, we don't need them. I think that's part of it. And also, in more recent years, as the country has gotten more internally repressive, what are these people to ask obnoxious questions? We don't have to deal with that kind of nonsense. We're the leader of China, so screw them. But I found that you can find online, there's a YouTube 15-minute clip of Edgar Snow talking to Zhou Enlai in 1964. And it's fascinating, both to hear what Zhou Enlai was like, but also the notion that Jiang Zemin would sit down, even if there was a foreign interlocutor with whom for whom he had as much trust and confidence as Mao and Zhou Enlai had in Edgar Snow. It's inconceivable that he would do that because he's just too elevated. They don't do that anymore.
I think one turning point may have been the Bloomberg and New York Times reports about the wealth of Premier Wen and the other Chinese official, that the Chinese were shocked that the Americans' media could penetrate in that way.
Figure it out, yeah.
I think that was another seminal moment. Yes.
Thank you. Alan Cash, I'm a writer and editor based in China until just last winter. I was wondering if we could reverse this, and you could tell us about your encounters or knowledge of Chinese correspondents in America and the West, and how that has changed and expanded or contracted in the last decades.
To be honest, I can't really. I stopped being a CNN correspondent in 2006, and I haven't lived in the States in years, so I've had almost no dealings with them. So I have to, maybe someone else has had more recent dealings. I would assume that as the constraints on the media in China have tightened, that shapes what they can and cannot say, but I haven't had any personal interactions. So, Michael,
So may we identify you as one of the Michaels?
If you wish, yes. I'd like to just be myself. Michael Kovrig, currently a senior advisor for Asia with the International Crisis Group. When I was a diplomat in China, one of the things that I struggled to try to convey in diplomatic reporting was the atmosphere around when you were talking particularly, not to average Chinese, but to government officials or anything that the party state and the government and the security ordinance touched, the degree to which there was a certain sense of, or some sense of fear or authoritarianism or oppression or control, the nervousness in your interlocutor, for example, the fact that when you went to interview somebody or talk to somebody, there would often be someone else sitting with them to keep an eye on things. How did you and your colleagues over the years observe, partly, so how did that sort of atmosphere change and evolve over time, and how did you deal with the challenge of conveying back to a reader who's probably never been to China, how it's different, how much more difficult it was to actually have that kind of conversation in China over the years than it would be in a Western context? How do you get that across?
It's a really interesting question. As a TV reporter, it would have been really hard to do that because you just see what you shot on screen, and you don't have the luxury of writing 5 paragraphs of context and so on. Sometimes people were very open. Sometimes people really had to be coaxed. I was there during a period, I mean, you know, where when I got there in '87, and it was a relatively upbeat time in China, and '88, I think, was the most open year intellectually, in some respects, in the whole history of the People's Republic. So it was there were lots of interesting people who were eager and willing to talk. There was the U.S. and China were friends. There wasn't this kind of edge. You know, there were plenty of situations where we weren't allowed to go somewhere where they wanted all the questions in advance. Getting people on camera was always a challenge. And then, we had Tiananmen, and you had about 18 months when you really couldn't do anything. You couldn't get permission to go anywhere, just kind of spinning.
The foreign ministry would say, "Butai Fan Bian."
Yeah. But then, then it began to open up, and I remember hearing from like business people in Guangdong and in Shanghai, you guys are missing something by being fixated on human rights and whether or not the U.S. is going to renew most favored nation status, because that's not what's going on down here. And I did this trip, and I did a series called The Tale of Two Chinas in '92. And once that kicked in, as long as you framed what you were going to do as we want to look at, the economic growth, the access was pretty good. And I think throughout the 90s, in terms of that aspect of the story, it was okay. But I mean, David Barboza told me at one point that Chinese companies, when he went in there as a business correspondent in the early 2000s, were more accessible than getting an American multinational to tell you what they're doing in China. Next to impossible. Chinese companies, oh yes, New York Times. So it's kind of mixed and paradoxical. And as journalists, we almost never had the access at the level where what you were talking about. I mean, maybe I saw John Pomfret in San Francisco, and he said he would periodically have lunch with Cui Tiankai, who later was the ambassador here. I never got that, but he would, but it was all off the record. It was sort of like what you do in Washington, but I never got that, and so for us, it wasn't in front of the camera. It didn't really help.
So we have the room for another half an hour. I see two questions, and then after we end the discussion, there'll be more beverages consumed, more socializing and connecting, I hope.
And more books sold.
And more books sold. So this is the cash bar. The bar out there is a credit card bar. So if you want to spend cash, that's the place. The credit cards are out there. So yes, where were those two questions?